We're ready.
All right, perfect. You want to go ahead and record, Kristen, and then we'll start the opening. All right, perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you to all who are here with us today for this webinar, What the Heck is UDL? We have closed captioning available for this webinar. If you require closed captioning, please select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select Show Subtitles. My name is Audrey Sandoval Gomez, and I'm the Associate Director at the Thompson Policy Institute at Chapman University. On behalf of the California Alliance for Inclusive Schooling, we are excited to offer this active education webinar series. We have partnered with many state and national organizations to bring you this series. We'd especially like to thank Orange County Department of Education for their partnership and support in the development of these webinars, the Commission on Teacher Credentialing for working with us to offer this alternative opportunity for teacher candidates to gather required clinical hours despite widespread school closures due to COVID-19. And thank you to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their commitment to teacher education and support to allow us to bring you this series today. To learn more about this webinar series, please visit www.inclusioncalifornia.org. We are happy to bring you our presenters, Dr. Kristen Brooks, Executive Director, and Kevin Schaefer, Director of Program Support, both from the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. They are both leading experts working across the state of California with educators on factors that support inclusive education. We are lucky to have them here with us today. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Audrey. We appreciate the offer to present one of our favorite topics, universal design for learning. And we will be talking about a lot more than just UDL. So we'd like to thank the California Alliance for Inclusive Schooling, the Thompson Policy Institute at Chapman University, for allowing us to share today. A little bit, and I'm Kevin Schaefer, Director of Program Support, and with me today is
Hi, Kristen Brooks, Executive Director with Riverside County Office of Education, supporting inclusive practices. Good morning.
And we are directors of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. We provide free events and thought partnering across California and work specifically with 45 districts in California to improve outcomes and increase inclusive opportunities for students with disabilities in general education settings. You can find out more about our project on Facebook or Twitter, SIP Inclusion, or from our website, www.sipinclusion.org. We wanted to start with our mission to increase the knowledge base of universal design for learning. And we wanted to do that by having you self-reflect on what inclusion is, why inclusion is important. And there are so many different definitions or understandings of the importance of including all students in general education settings in their least restrictive environment. We wanted to make sure that there was a foundational understanding that inclusion is a mindset. It's a way of thinking. It's not a program that we run or a classroom in our school or a favor we do to someone. Inclusion is who we are, and it is who we must strive to be. It's really the culture, and in working with a lot of our districts, the culture piece, the mindsets, the understanding of implicit bias within our system is a starting point for the implementation of universal design for learning, and that's where we'll begin today. Let's see who's here today. Kristen, if you could pull up the poll. We wanted to make sure that the 2 hours we spent together is interactive. So if you would list your role specifically, who's with us? Are you a teacher candidate? Are you a mentor teacher? A university or college supervisor? A university or college faculty? Or other? And if it's other, please enter in the chat your role. Awesome. Looks like we have a number of teacher candidates, a few university college supervisors. I see we have a SELPA instructional aide in the chat box. So a fairly broad audience with us today. We wanted to make sure that we provided resources and activity for teacher candidates and our supervising faculty. So we've created a Padlet. You can access the Padlet from the chat. I believe Jill entered the link. If you haven't used a Padlet before, it's a place that houses all of the resources. So Kristen's going to take us to the Padlet so we can walk you through the resources that are available to you, and you can design your own learning journey long after the presentation. So when you access the Padlet, you can click on any of the resources that you're interested in to either go to that website or access the resource. In the first column, every resource, every video that we address in the presentation today can be found in that first column. You can scroll all the way to the bottom and just look through the ones that interest you. Just know that everything that we present today will be in that first column. Additionally, in the second column, there's a resource called the Essential Elements. If you're interested in working with students with significant cognitive disabilities, these resources are a way to align grade level instruction with the 4 levels of students with significant cognitive disabilities, from mild to moderate to profound and severe. And we'll go through this resource more specifically at the end of today's presentation. In the third column, we've created UDL focused lesson plans. We'll address this also toward the end of the presentation, but you can create your own lesson plans as an activity to gain hours. Once you have the foundational information that we covered today, you'll be able to go in and access examples of high school and elementary lesson plans, as well as blank templates for you to complete. In the next column, we've included the teaching performance expectations. And in this column also, you might want to make note that we've taken each one of the TPEs and the elements in underneath each one, and we've created resources and activities for you to access. We'll get more specific as we go through the presentation today, but it's a way to focus on the TPEs that you're trying to address and then relating resources from UDL and other areas to that specific TPE. In the next 4 columns, you can have access to all the UDL resources. The first column here, what is UDL? Those are overarching resources that will give you more information broadly around the Universal Design for Learning framework. In the next 3 columns, the principles are outlined with go back just a little bit, Chris, there you go. The 3 principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression are available to you. So we've divided each one of those columns into the principles. So if you'd like to know more about the principle of engagement, you would just go to that engagement column and do your research and self-reflections on the resources and materials and videos that are available to you. So those are those 3 columns, and we'll continually go back to this Padlet as we go through the presentation. You can also continue your UDL journey through implementation rubrics to determine where you are within implementing UDL in your environments and your understanding. And then you can continue to move forward in next steps across the rubric. In the next column, and this is the last column of official resources, is connecting the dots around multiple tiers of support within a system of support. And each one of the connecting the dots resources focuses on various inclusive practices like positive behavior supports, restorative practices, universal design for learning for students with disabilities, GATE students, and English learners. And then in the next column, we have additional webinar extension activities, as well as your activity log, and then more information about Kristen and myself, and additional information on the active education webinars, and finally the survey. So as you can see, the Padlet is a plethora of resources that we made specifically for this training so that you have continued access to the resources and activities. Next slide. So today we have a few outcomes that we would like to address. The first is the connection between intersectionality and learner variability. You will hear a lot about learner variability and developing expert learners as two terms specific to universal design for learning. Our team has added a component of identity and intersectionality because we really have to understand the identities of the students that make up the learner variability within all of our classrooms, and the goal of UDL being the development of expert learners. We will take you through that process. We're also going to focus on deepening your foundational knowledge of the UDL framework and its relationship to lesson planning. And the lesson planning component is critical to this understanding because it's the proactive identification of potential barriers within our lessons, but also within the educational environment. We're going to focus on increasing your confidence in supporting and promoting educator efforts in creating universally designed lesson plans, and recognizing the importance of aligning institutes of higher education teacher preparation programs, teacher residencies, and LEA inclusive environments. We have a question in the chat. Does the Padlet expire? It does not. As long as you have the link, you will have access. We won't take it down. And we wanted to also just put into context, our goal today is to increase your foundational knowledge, to provide you with resources around UDL, and give you activities to continue your journey in areas of UDL that interest you. So one more poll. What is your level of understanding of the UDL framework? Is it you know what UDL stands for? You have a basic understanding, I have a moderate understanding, or I'm an expert and could be presenting with Kristen and Kevin. So take your pick. Where would you self-assess your knowledge of UDL? I see a basic understanding in the chat. You can also click one of the levels in the poll. We'll just give it another couple of seconds. Let's see what we have. I have a basic understanding at 58%, awesome. A moderate understanding, 31%. And I want to know who that one person is who's an expert and could be presenting with Kristen and Kevin. We'll have to meet that person. All right, thank you for participating. To start the presentation, we wanted to ground ourselves in the importance of shared responsibility and self-reflection. The first thing that we would like to present around Universal Design for Learning is that it is not a special education initiative. It came out of the special education world, and in some organizations, Universal Design for Learning is presented to special education staff. There's a belief that it's only for students with disabilities, and we'd like to crush that myth right off the bat. It's a shared responsibility of all students. All students are general education students first and foremost in the decisions that we make. In order to do that, our entire staff has to understand that it's a shared responsibility for all students, regardless of general ed, special ed, English learners. UDL applies to all students at the universal implementation stage. It also requires personal self-reflection and an understanding that we live in a society where specific groups of people are afforded privileges that are not accessible to other groups. Universal Design for Learning is that identification of barriers prior to instruction being delivered so that students have immediate access and equity.
All right, thank you, Kevin. That was a great intro. I'm going to step in here and talk a little bit about the history of our education, kind of how we got to where we are now and why UDL is so important as we're moving forward in the future of education. So we're going to talk a little bit about the past, and to figure out where we're headed. So back in the 1900s, this is just a mini history lesson. We won't go too deep, but there is an article at the bottom. You can see on the screen, Factories of Education, that has been posted on the Padlet for you if you want to dig deeper into this. But back in the 1900s, there was this thought around how do we create the most educated students to become the best skilled workers. And so there were these thoughts on either side of the fence. On one side, it was humanism, and that we need creative individuals who are poets and artists and writers and musicians. And then on the other side of the fence, it was, no, we need things to be standardized and systematic and efficient. Well, ultimately, if you know the history of education here in the US, Taylorism won out for a period of time. And so here's a little example of what that looked like. It was more of the factory models of education. And so it was really about scientifically determining the best way to perform a task. And if you think about growing up and what those kind of systematic tasks may have been for you, think back to the multiplication tables. You remember those tables? How fast can you do your multiplication facts in 60 seconds? And what happens if you couldn't? You had to do it again and again and again to show mastery of your understanding of multiplication. So what we want to think about is, what are we really testing here? Are we testing students' understanding of their facts, or are we testing speed? So that's a lot of what UDL is. Start with the goal. What is the goal? And there isn't one way to get there. And it's not about being average or having some standardized set of criteria met. It's so much more than that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you see the comparison on the left, we have the factories back then, and you can see the boss walking up and down the middle, making sure that the workers are facing forward, individually doing their work systematically and efficiently, and there's no collaboration or communication among those highly skilled workers. On the right, that is a reflection of the classrooms at the very same time. You can see the teacher in the back, the students facing forward, hands to themselves, no one's interacting, and it's all about being efficient, quiet, average, and moving through the system. So we have evolved over time. In the 19th century, it was about being right, working alone, sitting still, remembering facts, and streaming by skill levels. In the 20th century, we moved to more standardization. One size fits all. That's where we get our grade levels and our bells. Streaming by ability and teacher as the expert. And then as we move into the 21st century, we are seeing more creativity. We see the Common Core. We're working with others. We're imagining multiple solutions to a single problem. We're showing initiative and persevering. I know personally in my family, persevere is the word of the day every day. Persevere, persevere, persevere. And it's self-evaluation and self-reflection. Like Kevin talked about, we do as adults. Our students need to learn those skills as well. So here's just a little funny for you. You can see the students sitting at the desks, pumping information into their brains, getting ready to test. And it says, come away from the window. You don't want to be a child left behind, do you? And the little girl is clinging to the windowsill and says, sounds good to me, because she sees the arts and PE and all the beautiful sciences out the window that she's not being exposed to with this standardized system. So as Kevin mentioned, let's reflect a little bit on what your definition of inclusion is, and equity and access. And this is a little bit rhetorical, but feel free to enter into the chat what your thought is around inclusion, who is included or excluded, and what does that look like in our schools now. So here's a little visual representation as our teams go out into California and work with districts. Inclusion is at the top, right? So everybody's included together. There's a variety of individuals in the same circle or in the same educational setting. At the bottom, you see exclusion. Anybody different from green, from the average, is on the outside, completely excluded. Segregation is if you're different from green, but you may have some similar skills and abilities as someone has deemed you to have, you're off to the side together in a small group, but still outside the regular education setting. And then when we look at integration, you're in with the green, you're in with the average, but you're not quite fully included. Maybe you're at a back table with an instructional aide off to the side, but you're not quite learning alongside and being engaged with your peers. So hopefully this visual kind of helps you as we are moving forward today. So what we want to share with you right now is a video by Shelley Moore. She's out of British Columbia and is amazing. If you have not heard about Shelley Moore, you will be addicted potentially after this video, but you can also go to her website, 5 More Minutes, and I believe we have this video on the Padlet as well. So this is just a quick video that we would like to show you. So I'm going to stop share and open up the next slide.
Hi, my name is Shelley Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be philosophically versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I gonna explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we can have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball is the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to. The kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
All right. So feel free to enter in the chat your thoughts around that video. Shelley Moore's pretty great. And we want you guys to consider how would you change your aim, either now or as you move in to your next career field. And the question is, where did green come from? So Shelley Moore talked about the average. We showed you the dots before. Where did this concept of green or average come from? And so when you look at the visual on the right, you can see how individuals and students, they come into the public education system with all this variability and these amazing skills and abilities and differences. And we've up to this point been pumping them through the public education system, hoping that they're going to come out proficient and standardized and average and marching on, thinking that that's the best way to educate our kids. And we know so much more about how kids learn and the gifts that they bring to our classroom and the value add. So we really want you guys to move away from the thought of green and average today.
Thank you, Kristen. One of the resources that's also on your Padlet is the Special Education Task Force, One System, Reforming Education to Serve All Students. And one of the primary points that is made in this resource is that all students, regardless of need, are considered general education students first. That all educators, regardless of which students they are assigned to serve, have a collective responsibility to see that all children receive the education and supports they need to maximize their development and potential so they can participate meaningfully in the nation's economy and democracy. In order to participate meaningfully in the nation's economy and democracy, it means we also have to provide meaningful activities and opportunities for students to be included in classrooms. And inclusion isn't just a warm body in a general education setting. It's the meaningfully participation of the students in those settings, and the systems and the mindsets of all the adults in that system also have to promote that inclusive perspective. So just so we all have the same understanding of equitable education, we wanted to make sure that we started with an understanding that inclusive education, equitable education, is putting into place the policies, the practices, the programs, the focus on an inclusive mindset and culture are necessary to eliminate educational barriers. And the reason that we put identity work in our trainings is that in many cases, the lack of inclusive opportunities is based on gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, etc. The identities that students bring to the settings and the response of the adults in those settings can also result in lowered standards. So we wanted to make sure you had access to this definition. And even though it's from 1997, it's still so applicable today. So we have a quick story to tell. When we are not sure of what students can learn, presume competence and the ability to learn. And in my years as a special education teacher, I can't count the number of times that we would receive a new student, and the student would have an IEP, and I would take the IEP to the teacher, and you could almost see the wheels turning, in that the IEP in so many cases represents what a student is unable to do. And the decisions that we make in so many cases is based on that deficit-based thinking around the specific identity of ability or disability. So we'll get more into that, but we also wanted to tell you the story of Patrick and Beth Foraker. So Beth is a supervisor in the Teacher Education College at UC Davis, and Patrick is her son. Patrick was born with Down syndrome, and Davis is a community that is inclusive as a community, but also through the schooling. So in Patrick's experience, he was included through his entire educational career, up to the point of his graduation with a diploma. And Beth talks a lot about her role as a parent and being excluded because of Patrick's disability. And one of the examples that she gives is when Patrick was born, on the outside of her hospital room, there was a sign placed that said "No visitors allowed," which she didn't know. So she couldn't understand why friends and family weren't visiting. And just that whole idea that the hospital made the assumption that she would be mourning Patrick's disability. And she's never mourned Patrick's disability. She's always promoted it and made sure that he was availed of the opportunities that all other students were availed of, because she understood that if a student is segregated in the educational system, how are we going to teach them the skills to interact with typically developing peers and problem solve and create relationships when they leave our system? So Patrick is currently at George Mason University on the East Coast, living independently in the dorms. And he's on track for a four-year college diploma in the area of movie directing. And this is a post that that Beth posted of Patrick leaving for his second semester in his sophomore year of college. So she credits his inclusive opportunities all through school to be able to function independently in a college setting. So she always made the point of presuming competence for Patrick. And if we don't know what opportunities are available to Patrick, how can we make sure that we are preparing them for college or careers of their choice, to be self-determined. So this is the whole purpose of universal design for learning, is to ensure all students have the opportunity to understand how they learn in the educational setting and take that with them when they leave our system, to be self-determined and to be self-advocates for themselves. So let's do a little comparison of what inclusion is and what inclusion is not, and kind of self-reflect on if you're currently in an educational setting, or before shelter in place, we're in an educational setting. Kind of self-reflect on your experience of what inclusion is and what inclusion is not, based on the organizational setup. So inclusion is educational equity and access. It is not dump and hope. In many cases, if we look at inclusion as a compliance requirement, then we're not going to meaningfully include students. We're going to dump and hope that everything works out. It's a sense of community and belonging. It is not general education setting with a one-on-one untrained aide. And I've had some of the best paraeducators in my career, but an untrained aide is not going to be helpful to include a student. So we have to be very clear on who's supporting this process. It is educational benefit for all students, not just mainstreaming. And we want to be really clear on the difference between inclusion and mainstreaming. Inclusion is having a home, creating community and a sense of belonging in that least restrictive setting, the general education setting, as appropriate. Mainstreaming is visiting those inclusive settings, but their home base is in another setting with another teacher, or a silo effect being created. It is a philosophy that all students can learn. It is not for compliance. As we mentioned earlier, and I skipped one, it is for independence and interdependence between students and adults. It's not line of sight inclusion, where like when we were looking at segregation, where the students who are being segregated are seeing the opportunities and the activities of their peers who are included. And then finally, inclusion is breaking down silos.
So we have a question for you guys out in the audience. Is disability socially constructed? And if so, what does that mean for schools? So essentially there are a couple schools of thought around disability, and there's sort of a social model and a medical model. And medically, folks look at disability as you are born with or acquire an impairment. So you are born with Down syndrome, or you acquire a traumatic brain injury. And so therefore you are disabled. Versus on the other end, folks think the social disability model is more around you are born with or acquire an impairment, but you aren't disabled until you come in contact with the program's policies, people, and structures. And quick story to kind of emphasize this is I had a previous position as director of special education, and one of my jobs was, as students came in from out of state, I had to look at their IEP and determine the most like program to place them immediately here in California. And so I was reading an IEP, and the student presented very impaired, so not cognitively impaired to the greatest extent, but to a pretty good extent, mobility issues, limited expressive vocabulary, so seemed to have some definite needs. And so as I'm reading down, I'm thinking through my head, okay, where would we place the student? And when I got to the bottom of the IEP from New York, the student was in gen ed and not with a one-on-one aide. The aide was only there for mobility, for transferring between classrooms, but the student was fully included in general education. And at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, we don't have those supports in place. So my question to you is, did the student become more disabled because he moved to California? He seemed to be doing just fine in New York. So that really flipped my thinking for sure, because we hear a lot about, well, he's not ready to be included. She's not ready to be included. They're not ready to be included. And it is not a student readiness model. It is an adult and a systems readiness model to include kids. So really want to think about that, because that social model makes us reflect on what are those barriers that maybe we have self-imposed in the environment, in our policies, in our practices, and in our own biases that have been disabling conditions for students who are otherwise impaired. So looking at what are the barriers to the next evolution, you see here are the dots again for you, but on the far right we are minimizing that green as the focus, right? That we're not saying that there are average students out there. That's absolutely the opposite. We want to demystify the average. So thinking about what are those barriers that are out there to that next evolution. And there was a book written, or is a book written, by Dr. Todd Rose, who's a professor at Harvard, who actually is a high school dropout, if you can believe, and is now a professor at Harvard. And the book is called The End of Average, and there's a reference to that on the Padlet as well. And in this book, he talks about demystifying the average, and he equates it to a story about in the Air Force and how fighter jets, the size of the cockpit did not fit the quote average pilot. It actually was fitting no one. So they looked at redesigning the cockpit to meet the needs of a range of pilots. Height and weight and body type frame. And so ultimately what they did was come up with an adjustable seat. And lo and behold, they're able to accommodate more than just the quote average pilot that actually, there was no average, it fit no one. And so we have more female pilots in the Air Force now more than ever. All ranges and sizes and simply just by adjusting the cockpit. So why tell that story? What does that mean for you in education? It's because if we design, or if we think first about the curriculum, or we think first about the plane, and then we think about our students, what we're gonna end up doing is playing whack-a-mole. And we're gonna have a lesson plan for you and for you and for you. We're gonna have an IEP for you and for you and for you. Because we thought about the curriculum as it was standardized for the average student that doesn't exist. And then we thought about the variability of our students, but keeping in mind the focus was only down the middle, right? Only down the average student lane. So what we wanna do is flip the system a bit, and we wanna think about students and all the variability that they bring to education first, that they bring to our classrooms first. Then we design and roll out the curriculum, and we have what Shelley Moore calls happy planes of love. So thinking again about the variability of the students first, because we know that they're coming to our classrooms with various skills and abilities. We can plan for that in advance. We talk a lot about knowing your students, spending the first couple weeks, and absolutely important in relationship building, but we also know that we can walk into any classroom across the US, and we're gonna have students who maybe are English language learners or foster youth or have behavior issues or may have a learning disability or maybe tactilely defensive. We're gonna have this variability. We've seen it in our classrooms, so we plan for it and we remove those barriers because we're thinking about the variability of our kids before we're rolling out the instruction. So here's another little analogy, and this is really related to accommodations. And we have a triangle here because we love triangles in California. We're all about pyramids and structures and tiers. And what Kevin and I want to emphasize is that kids aren't in tiers. Resources and supports are in tiers. And so here's an analogy. Think about the lens of waking up and preparing for this webinar today. Looking in tier one, think about who needed tier one supports, who needed to access a cup of coffee to get ready for this morning, who needed to access an alarm clock, maybe and a cup of coffee, who needed tier two supports where you needed an alarm clock, a cup of coffee, and a really good breakfast to be able to focus today on yet another Zoom webinar. And then how many of you out there are accessing those tier three supports who said, it doesn't matter what time this should not have started, or what resources you have, this should not have started at 10 a.m. This should have been more like noon or 1. So it's based on the context, right? And when I think about this and apply it to my own life, when Kevin and I travel, we're out at presentations, we're all over the state, and we are always gearing up and wanting to be our best. I actually have 3 alarm clocks that I use. I have one under my pillow with my cell phone. I have the wake up call through the front desk, and I always ask my husband to text me or call me to wake me up because I'm so afraid I'm not going to wake up. So in those cases, in that context of traveling and presenting, I'm accessing tier 3 supports, right? The most I can get. Whereas on a typical day, I may need just an alarm clock, or Saturday morning, I don't need anything because my kids are going to be up for sports or ready to start the day. So it's always based on the context and knowing that accommodations allow access. It's not cheating, it's allowing access to the context, to the curriculum, to the supports that are available, and self-selecting what you need at the time. All right, so here's another analogy for us. As Kevin talked about breaking down silos. So here's the question. What is this a photo of? And lots of folks say, it's a car wash, or, it's a fundraiser. So I want you to think about this car being a rental car. And rhetorical question, don't you wash your rental car? And of course not. Well, why? So some of the reasons, well, it's not mine. I only have it for a little bit of time. I'm just borrowing it for a bit. It's someone else's job. And so I want you to think about how sometimes we treat our kids like this, right? Well, I only have the student for this year, and then thank goodness I'm done. Or no, that's her student, that's not my student. I didn't sign up to work with students with disabilities. That's not what my credential is in. That's someone else's issue, right? Not my responsibility. I'm down the hall. That's another grade level. And so what we want to do is embrace all kids, however they're identified, right? And have ownership and accountability for all kids in our system. And so the thought being, or the concept that probabilities for managers and possibilities for leaders. And so if we liken this to a baseball analogy, you know, the probability of hitting the ball, having a great average in baseball is the 300 average, right? That's the probability that you're going to hit that ball and you're going to fail, for lack of a better term, 7 out of 10 times. And so in school, that's an F, you failed. But yet in baseball, you're making millions. And it's because there's the possibility that you're going to hit that ball and you're going to get a home run, or at least, you know, get a man run in. Something is going to happen. But that possibility is focused on because they provide the best coaches and training and sleeping arrangements and constant honing of skills out of the possibility that they're going to hit that ball. So if we stick with probability, the probability is you're never going to hit it. Probability is kids with disabilities, they're always going to be red on the dashboard, right? Don't focus on that. Focus on the possibility, and as Kevin mentioned, opening the doors for students like Patrick and everybody else out there who deserves the best we have every day. So getting into UDL. UDL started out of architecture and then was generalized to learning. And so when we think about universally designing, take a look at this photo and think about all the different ways that you could get to the top and who can access this. Right, so you can see using strollers and wheelchairs, if you're on crutches temporarily, maybe a toddler learning how to walk, someone maybe who's elderly and needs to hold the handrail, or you just want to use those stairs and get your steps in, or whatever it may be. There's options and choice to get to the top, that there's not just one way. So that gets applied in education. And why do UDL now? Like Kevin said, it's not a special ed thing or a general ed thing, it's just an education thing. And it's time that we move in the evolution of that instruction and in our education to embrace the variability in all of our learners. So UDL defined kind of basically is it provides flexibility in the ways that information is presented, how kids respond and demonstrate what they learn, know, and can do, and how they're engaged. And it reduces those barriers to instruction from the beginning. We're going to talk about differentiated instruction versus universal design and how there is some crossover, but this is really that proactive design to reduce barriers before kids even walk into the classroom. And it's not just for kids with disabilities or students who are limited English proficient, it's for all kids. So we're going to watch a little video about the difference between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. And this is Dr. Katie Novak, who's back east. She's an assistant superintendent and also runs her own consulting business. And she's fantastic, a huge guru in UDL. So we're going to listen to her analogy. So I'm going to stop share and switch over.
So people ask me all the time, what on earth is UDL? UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning, and it is not differentiated instruction. Whenever I present to teachers or I talk to teachers and I say, oh, UDL is a really great way to give kids choices for how they're going to learn and how they're going to personalize their learning, I hear, oh, I do that already. We used to call it DI. Well, DI exists and UDL exists, and they are actually two different things. And so to give you a little analogy, UDL is kind of like when you're having a dinner party when you put out a buffet. So when you're teaching and you want to give students choices for how they're going to learn, you would put out a buffet of options. For example, you would say, after you are solving all of these math problems, you're going to explain or justify how you solve them. And you can do that in a poem, or you can do that in a narrative, or you can create a little skit, or you can do a poster, and you're going to justify your answer. And so what you're doing is you're putting out a buffet of all options. And by nature of having those options, students have to become very creative and self-directed and choose what's best for them. Differentiated instruction, on the other hand, is a similar framework in that it's still providing options for students, but those options are often managed by the teacher. For example, I might say to a certain student, you know, I know you have a hard time writing, and so why don't you draw me a picture about how you solve that? Or I might take a whole group of students who I think need a little bit more challenge, and I take them aside and I say, okay, because you're finished, I want you to work on this. And so those options are kind of like making meals for every single kid in your class. And if I had the option to either put out a buffet and allow my students to choose, or to make 30 meals, I would choose putting out a buffet. And so part of teaching and learning today is about giving students control of their own learning and transferring some of that power back to them, because coming up to a buffet requires that you have to self-assess. You have to think about what is it that you need to eat and what is it can you eat, and then you put it on a plate together. Whereas as teachers, if we're worried all the time about creating these perfect meals for everyone, we're going to be exhausted and we're going to be burnt out in the kitchen.
So that was Katie Novak, and she's written several books, and you can learn a lot more about her research and her presentation delivery. She's a great resource. So going in line with what she mentioned in terms of the buffet and that analogy. So think about, we talked about goals being the number one thing as you're designing your lessons and working with students. What is the goal? What do you want your kids to learn, know, and do? So a quick example is, let's say my goal was I wanted to invite everybody over to my house on Sunday. We're gonna have a big celebration of just a COVID party because we've all been released from shelter in place. And so I want you guys all to come over. So my goal is to have you all over, to only go to the grocery store once, and to not spend too much time cooking because I want to socialize with you, right? So I have those three goals. Not knowing you, right, because we just met on this webinar, but knowing that there's variability, I should be planning for that, right? So if I just decide that I'm going to make this Spanish lasagna, right, or Mexican lasagna, then who am I including or excluding? And so feel free to enter into the chat who's included or excluded with just this meal. And you're right, Paul, sometimes students don't know what they don't know, and they don't know how to self-assess their needs or make a decision. So that's how we're guiding them to become an expert learner and making them aware of the resources and supports that are out there and helping them through that process, right? Dairy-free, dairy allergy, people with a special diet, vegetarians, vegans, absolutely. Yep, and it was spicy. What about my kids, right? People who don't like Mexican food. Just the cilantro might throw people off, right, Ryan? Exactly. So thinking about, gluten, thinking about variability in mind, what if I decided instead to do this? And I decide that I'm gonna make a make your own pizza buffet, right? So I'm looking at different options and toppings. So people who maybe are on the keto diet or protein only, maybe they're gonna have a big pile of protein. Maybe I have some gluten-free bread choices. People can use meat or veggies, cheese or not, create their own, right? How much more likely am I to have you guys engage in that meal with me when I'm providing options and choice, right? And am I still meeting my goals? Did you guys all still come over to my house for the brunch? Did I only go to the grocery store once? And did I spend a minimal amount of time cooking because you guys were making your own anyway, right? So I met my goal. We're always gonna have to sort of have another backup plan, right? We're gonna always have to kind of differentiate and individualize, but going in with learner variability or participant variability in mind first, we have a larger chance of meeting those needs.
So we're going to approach the conversation of learner variability through a lens of intersectionality. And this is a piece that we've added, as I said earlier, to really understand not only student identities, but our own self-reflection on our approach or response to various identities, typically those that are different from our own. So we can think of a student like a circle. So the student also within that circle has multiple identities. And they are the intersection of those many identities that are coming up on the screen currently. In some cases, when students are identified as students with disabilities, and we're using disabilities as just the example for this portion of the presentation, you could insert any identity. So when students are identified as a student with a disability, what happens to all of the other identities in many cases? And exactly what's happening on the screen, where the other identities in so many cases fall away, and that student is known by that one identity of deficit. And the decisions that we make as adults based on that one identity from a deficit perspective, in so many cases, lowers the standards for that student. Even though students with disabilities at a rate of 80% have average or above average cognitive ability, that if provided the supports and the services and the access appropriate to their disability, they should be able to learn at the same or similar trajectory as their peers. So we have to be very careful on how we label students based on that singular identity, based on a deficit model. And that's the intersection of the identities. And someone in the chat had mentioned that students perform differently in different environments based on the context. So we have to honor that jagged learning profile that we'll talk about in just a second, that all students, all adults have a jagged learning profile based on the context, based on their interest, based on their experience within that context. So the question, and you can answer in the chat, how does that perception from a deficit perspective impact student experience and outcome, and also their self-perception of their abilities within the educational system? So you go ahead and answer that in the chat. We have to look at that intersectionality and the variability of learners through a bias perspective and recognize or self-reflect on our own biases, and we all have them. So just a few things that we can do is observe ourselves, reflect on identities, both our response to identities around us, as well as those that are occurring within our classrooms. We can broaden our cultural experiences and knowledge, ground ourselves in a definition of equity and inclusion, and lean into this work. So one of the activities, and you can find this activity in the first column on your Padlet, it's identity development. And when you're doing that self-reflection within this activity, there's 6 ways in which we approach identities. The first 3 are from a deficit perspective. Repulsion and fear. So think about the various identities. For example, a student with a significant cognitive disability or severe behaviors. What is your approach or your reaction to some of the identities in your classroom environments? Is it an approach of repulsion or fear? Is it an approach of pity? And in many cases, an approach of pity is that whole idea of lowering standards because you feel sorry for a specific student population. Or neutrality and ambivalence, just go about your day without recognizing that deficit-based response. The 3 approaches from an asset-based perspective could be one of acceptance, admiration, or from an ally perspective. So I would highly encourage you to go through these 6 different levels. And then on the next slide, and this is also on your Padlet, you can do a rating from 1 to 6, and you can replace the term race in the second page with a specific race, African American, Caucasian, Asian, and then go back to those 6 approaches and determine your reflection or your response to students with various identities. You can do the same thing with class, gender, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, language. So you can make your own rating scale based on the identities that you're most interested in, but this is the self-reflection piece that has to happen in order for students to meaningfully be included. And we can look at that through a perspective of the cycle of failure. And going back to Beth Foraker, she introduced us to the term of soft bigotry of low expectations, which took me a minute to really understand what that means. And it means that there is this idea of low expectations, and having those low expectations or presuming incompetence, that there's a soft bigotry, or without knowing or understanding what we're doing is creating lessened outcomes for our students. So the cycle goes through students experiencing marginalization within the educational system, deficit view of that student that we just talked about, and lower expectations for students with a label and placement of student in remedial learning, and then the result, remedial learning perpetuating school failure. But not only school failure, but also post-secondary outcomes and opportunities that that student will be availed. So we have a really short piece of a video that Katie Novak did an hour-long presentation for us. And we just took a little snippet of it where she talks about her own twins and their experience with a student with severe or profound disabilities within that inclusive environment. So we're gonna listen to the short video.
Brother, the bookend, and that's one of their best friend, James. And James has Fragile X syndrome, and he's almost completely nonverbal, and obviously, significantly developmentally delayed cognitively. And they are just the three best of friends. And the really cool thing about this story here is that, Aylin, from the first time she met him, she was like a warrior for James. And so when he was in first grade, when he gets really excited, he flaps his hands a little bit. And so he was running outside doing tag, and he was flapping his hands, and a bunch of little girls went up to him and said, "Why do you always do that with your hands?" And Aylin sees this across the playground, and she comes like busting across. And I hear this from a teacher who's my colleague. And she said, "Hey, ladies, if you're gonna mess with someone, you're gonna have to mess with me." And this is just like a little ball of fire. Now, I'll tell you something else about my daughter, Aylin, which is that she has severe combined type ADHD. And for all the amazing strengths and beauty and fire she brings into this world, she can also be really impulsive and dangerous and violent. And those are ways that you could describe her, but that's not her. She's just Aylin, and she brings all these amazing strengths to the classroom, and she also brings these amazing areas that she needs to work on. And so what's really beautiful about this picture to me is that Brecken is significantly above grade level, and James is significantly below grade level, and Aylin exhibits behaviors that most classroom teachers will never ever want to see. But the three of them are in the same class together all day, every day, and they are challenged and they are supported equally because of universal design for learning. And in most places in this world, they would be separated. And they would be separated because there would be a belief that Brecken deserves more, that he deserves better, and that James can't do it, and that Aylin doesn't belong there because she can't behave. And what I will tell you is I will fight this fight until every parent of all of these kids gets to see that they belong together, that in this world, we all belong together. And when you separate them, what you're saying is that James and Aylin have nothing to offer Brecken, and they do. They all have equal amazing things to offer each other.
It's really one of my all-time favorite snippets of a video. And the bringing it back to Patrick Foraker, Beth talks about him going to college, which is such an amazing opportunity that Patrick was provided. But from her perspective, because he was included, he is able to experience the small things in life that we take for granted. For example, he will FaceTime her. He did back in January. He FaceTimed her and said, "Mom, guess where I am? I'm in the back of an Uber that I called going to a Super Bowl game with my friends." And it's those opportunities that Patrick would have missed out on had he not been included throughout his educational system. So it's those small things that Patrick experiences that brings Beth to a different level of understanding of why all students need to have that access to their peers. And then the quote by Nelson Mandela, "The world's problems begin with the belief that some human lives are more valuable than others." And we had attended a conference in Riverside, County Office of Ed, and the stage was filled with students. And the last question that the moderator asked was, if you could say one thing to educators, and the room was filled with about 1,200 educators, if you could say one thing to them, what would it be? And Kristen and I were frantically writing down all of their responses. So Kristen's just going to bring up the quotes one at a time, and we'll let you read them to yourself. And as you can imagine, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. As each student spoke their truth, it really forced the audience to self-reflect on our role, whether we're an educator in a classroom, an administrator, an Institute of Higher Ed faculty member. What is our role to make sure that students have equitable opportunities across various identities? So we're going to move into learner variability specific to universal design for learning. And we have a quick activity, and someone in the chat had mentioned, you know, that people learn in different situations, in different settings, in different environments. And there's so many factors that go into that. And we have to make sure that we don't bookend our students into only having one opportunity to experience education. So what we'd like you to do, and we're going to pull up three polls, and we'd like for you to self-assess which stage you are in when the activity is presented itself in the poll. So stage 1 is you're completely unable to perform the task. Stage 2 is you're able to perform the task, but you need help. Stage 3, you're able to perform the task independently, but not proficiently. Or stage 4, you are proficient at the task, you're proficient at performing the task completely independently, okay? So we're gonna bring up the first poll, and we'd like you to self-assess your abilities across all of the activities. And here's the first one. In calculus, solving a calculus problem, are you at stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4? Mark your answer. I can tell you I would click stage 1 if I were to participate. Give it a couple seconds. All right, let's see what we have. So it looks like we have a lot of participants in the same boat I'm in, stage 1, so unable to perform the task. So think about what you chose, what stage you chose in this activity, and let's see what the next activity is. So I was a stage 1 for calculus. Figure skating. Can you jump and spin? What stage are you if you were asked to figure skate? And in this case, I went from stage 1 all the way over to stage 4, having been a competitive ice skater for about 12 years. So my experience with calculus and my experience with ice skating are completely different. But if I had been placed, using a special education term, if I had been placed in a self-contained, separated environment based on my calculus ability, I would have never been able to perform at stage 4 in ice skating. Let's look at our next activity. Oh, look, stage 1. Looks like a lot of people were stage 1. Nobody was in stage 4 with me. And we have to look at our educational environment from a perspective of context. We could also add, are you a morning person? Are you an afternoon person? Knowing yourself as a learner, how you learn best, is what we're talking about when we get to expert learners. Let's look at the next activity. Read a romance novel written at the 5th grade level. Now this one's interesting because I don't read romance novels, so I'm really not interested. I could do it, but I don't do it. So I would have to say I could do it. I could be at stage 4, but typically I lose interest and don't complete the task. So that could also be an assumption that I can't do it. So we have to make sure that we're assessing on what we're teaching. Let's see how the others have performed with reading a romance novel. Stage 4. We have a couple of stage 2, stage 3s. This activity really goes back to interest. I don't have an interest in reading romance novels, but if you put Katie Novak book or a Shelley Moore book in front of me, I will read that cover to cover before the night ends. So really think about that whole idea of interest, expertise, and ability. And this is the idea of jagged learning profile. So similar to what Kristen talked about with the fighter pilots, by having cockpits that are flexible, we have an opportunity to increase our number of pilots. So height, shoulders, chest, waist, hips are all different. There is no average. And when they're designing cockpits for the average person, they're actually designing it for no one. Same thing with our lesson design and our educational environment based on memory. We're really great at memory. Our language might be a little bit lower. Our knowledge level in certain areas, reading might be a low. So we have to look at student identity, student ability, and allow that flexibility for students to understand themselves. So a couple things about learner variability. Number one, it's systematic and to a large degree predictable. There's never been a classroom where every student at any moment in time is at the same place academically, behaviorally, developmentally. So we have to plan for that variability. And as we just talked about, learner capacities are context dependent. Okay, so keep that in mind as we move through the rest of the presentation, looking at those guidelines. So expert learners, that's another specific vocabulary term to universal design for learning. So we honor the learner variability to develop expert learners. So quick activity, and you can just enter this in the chat. We'd like you to answer this sentence frame. In my opinion, the #1 quality of a student who is college, career, and civic life ready is blank, because blank. So what is that one adjective that you could say would determine or show that a student is college, career, and civic life ready when they leave our system? For example, we had one participant say, they can persevere because it allows them to complete their assignments when it gets difficult. So what's a couple more? Self-aware, absolutely. Self-advocacy, that's the one that I would have picked, Laurel, self-advocacy. Students are able to ask for what they need across many different environments. Efficacy, excellent. Determination. Self-advocate also. Motivated. So you can see that there's commonality with these adjectives. The one adjective, and Chris and I have done this activity with thousands of people, the one adjective that we haven't received ever is academically proficient. But if we are able to instill in our students exactly what you're responding to, then we have students that are expert learners. They may not be GATE students or gifted students in our educational environment, but as Kristen said, with the factories of education, we're looking for students who can collaborate. We're looking for students who can get their needs met and be resourceful, etc. So this is just a precursor to how we describe an expert learner within the UDL framework. And when we look at very specific characteristics, we can put them in the 3 principles of universal design for learning. So the characteristics of a learner with an engagement, you can see in the green column. The characteristics of an expert learner in the representation principle in the purple column. And then for action and expression, same thing. Our students are strategic and they're goal-directed learners. These are the characteristics in how we are developing students to become expert learners, self-advocates, able to persevere, able to self-regulate, etc. And then we put this, we're not going to have time to watch this video, but it's a first grade class and we've added some questions. This video is also on your Padlet in that first column, and it's on the link within the PowerPoint that you can download. But it's a first grade class and the teacher really focuses on choice in the lesson on comprehending and retelling a story. So we wanted to call that out, and if you want to as an activity, watch the video. It's about 7 to 8 minutes, I believe, and then answer the questions that are provided and self-reflect on your thoughts on how the teacher is providing students to choose the way that they learn best and to self-reflect on their success or their lack of success. And this is a graphic of the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. Kristen's going to go over it in a little bit of a deeper portion of the presentation, but we have the principles of engagement, representation, and action expression. And you can see at the very bottom, the goal of UDL, or the foundation of this visual, is the creation of expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-directed. So we just wanted to connect with the previous slide on the characteristics of an expert learner and how that fits into the Universal Design for Learning framework. And then you can also click the link and that will take you to an interactive guidelines webpage that you can download. And you can click on any section of this graphic and it will take you to more information and activities on what that particular principle, guideline, or checkpoint refers to, and give you some instructional ideas. And just a quick overview of Universal Design for Learning is that it's a theoretical framework. It's not a curriculum. It's not a toolbox. And it's developed by CAST. That's the Center for Applied Special Technology. You can visit their website at www.cast.org. To develop curricula, materials, instruction, lesson plans that are flexible and supportive of all students. It meets the needs of individuals with disabilities and accommodations that they need, but remember, it's proactive. It's the design from the outset. And it's also benefiting all students. So it's the design of objectives, assessments, methods, and materials that are usable and accessible and equitable for all. And the question becomes, is our learning environment welcoming? Another quick definition of UDL is that it's proactive design of curriculum and instruction to ensure they are educationally accessible. I hope by putting all of these different definitions of UDL into the presentation, you get the idea that it's looking at what you already do and maybe expanding your learning from that point forward. Also, as Kristen mentioned, it's based on architecture. So looking at the physical barriers similar to our instructional barriers is critical. So if we think about curb cuts, they were designed for individuals in wheelchairs, but used by strollers and joggers. Everybody gets their needs met within the physical environment as well as the educational or instructional environment. So we can look at that very similarly. And we're going to watch another quick video. And this is a video, it's about a restaurant called Signs. And it's staffed by all deaf waiters. And what we'd like you to do is do a comparison. What do you see in the video that helps the customers get their needs met to have dinner or to receive and eat their food? And what is in place within that restaurant environment that also allows the deaf workers to have a competitive integrated wage? So try to do a comparison between the restaurant and the educational setting.
Unique dining experience has just reached Canada. You can find it at a restaurant in downtown Toronto. It's different because the menu not only caters to the taste buds, it also speaks a language of food you won't hear anywhere else. Joanna Remiliotis explains.
The menus are ready, the sliders ready to grill, the staff dressed and ready to go. Opening night of a brand new restaurant in town, where the goal of the evening is to have your order fall on deaf ears. Yep, you heard that right.
This is Canada's first restaurant staffed with deaf waiters and waitresses.
But in terms of an idea, how...
Idea, this is the first one of its kind.
Aptly named Signs, this is a place where you have to follow the signs. Customers are asked to order food and drink using American Sign Language. There are icons next to every menu item and a cheat sheet to help.
Oh yeah, red something and then beet and then watermelon.
And what does that mean?
Red beet watermelon salad.
I think I'm gonna have to jump.
What's that? Sign it.
Jump.
Yeah, you're gonna have to sign that.
It's like this. This.
Exciting. And Jan Manikumar wanted to deliver a whole new dining experience and give deaf people a chance to shine.
Providing them an opportunity here, I think, is something that they deserve, and they are very talented. Every one of them, every one of my staff, I'm very happy to say they are extremely talented.
More than 200 deaf people applied to work here. Most of the 50 or so who made the cut have no restaurant experience, but a passion to learn.
Giving the deaf community the opportunity to work in a workforce that they wouldn't otherwise be able to work in. And it's opening up a whole new workforce for the deaf community.
This is Mehdi Safavi's first full-time job. An interpreter helped us ask him how that feels.
It's wonderful. I'm so excited to be here. It's a deaf environment where hearing people can come in and experience our world and our culture. So it's really amazing, really amazing. And it's a challenge for me, but a great challenge.
It's brand new, but already there's a buzz and reservations are pouring in.
Your biggest problem right now is that you have too much business?
I might have to. So.
And all through an entirely different word of mouth. Joanna Bermeliotis, CBC News, Toronto.
So go ahead and enter your thoughts around the comparison of the restaurant with our educational system. A couple thoughts that brings to my mind is, it was interesting that by virtue of stepping into that restaurant setting and the language of power shifted, that by taking one step into the restaurant, the customers became disabled. I also think about the icons in helping the customers get their needs met by using the icons on the menus that were available to them. And I also have to self-reflect on the waiter, where the narrator said that it was his first full-time job. And my question is, did he all of a sudden get trained to become a waiter, or did the environment change such that it allowed him to have the opportunity to earn that living wage? So I love the comments that are coming through on the chat. But we also have to design our learning environments the same way to ensure that our learning environment is accessible. And we don't look at our students from a disabled perspective. We look at our environment and our curriculum as disabled. And then how do we open up accessibility based on that? So thank you for participating in the chat on that last video.
All right, thanks, Kevin. We're going to move into the meat and potatoes of UDL, which is the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. And so we're going to go through this relatively quickly, only because interest of time, but there is so much. And Kevin shared the guidelines that are going to come up on the screen in just a second. But as he mentioned, they're interactive, and you can really go down a rabbit hole with each of the guidelines and checkpoints within those. So we're going to kind of give you an overview, and then know that you will be able to explore those more deeply on your own. So we're going to talk about how to read those guidelines. And this is a really quick, I think it's about a minute video, but it outlines it really well in terms of how to read that actual document. So I'm going to stop share.
Let's look at how the UDL guidelines are laid out and how you should approach implementing them in your instruction. First, there are 3 principles. Starting from the left, we have provide multiple means of engagement, laid out in green. Next, in purple, is provide multiple means of representation. Finally, in blue, is the last principle, provide multiple means of action and expression. The goal for each principle can be found at the bottom of each column. Now, within each principle are 3 blocks. These are guidelines, which are supported by individual checkpoints. All right, those are the 3 layers of information: principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. But where do you start? Well, the UDL principles are not given a hierarchy. Engagement doesn't outrank action and expression, but they are laid out in the progression of a typical lesson. You begin by engaging the students, then you introduce the content and skills required by your learning objectives, and then they perform some activity to produce evidence of having learned the content or skill. Granted, that's overly simplistic, but you get the point. Now, let's look at how the guidelines in each principle progress from one to the next. When we talk about engagement, we're looking at motivation. And in education psychology, we have 3 indicators for motivation: active choice, persistence, and effort. These indicators answer the basic motivational questions: did they choose to engage? Did they stick with it to the end? And how hard did they work along the way? The first guideline is all about getting the learner to choose to engage or to actively choose to participate. So the learner is engaged. What next? The learner is provided options to persist and give effort towards completing a learning goal or objective. Finally, we get to self-regulation. A self-regulated learner is driven intrinsically. They own and inform their own learning and need fewer external supports to actively choose, give effort, and persist when challenged. Make sense? Now for representation. This principle is aligned with the way that our brains take in, make sense of, and retain information. Take a look at this diagram. It outlines what researchers have dubbed the information processing system. According to this model, human memory has 3 components: the short-term memory store, working memory, and long-term memory. Long-term memory is our goal. We want the content and skills ready for use to solve novel problems, but we have a journey to get there. First, your senses are receiving information constantly, but only that stimuli to which you attend makes it to working memory. If you're not paying attention to it, that information is lost. So, learners need the information brought into focus to their senses so they can perceive it. This is the challenge of the first guideline of representation. Next, in working memory, our brain tries to make sense of what it's perceiving. The information has to be decipherable in order for us to have any chance of making meaning of it and storing it in long-term memory. For example, a printed word is visually a variance in contrast and color to the page it's written on. If we can identify that variance as symbols, in this case, the letters of the word, we have a chance of deciphering and understanding the information being conveyed. So this guideline offers support for decoding words and symbols. Now, we make sense of the information, but is it worth retaining? Why should our brains hold on to this? Well, there are 2 main paths to retention: rehearsal and relation. And relation is by far the more efficient method of retaining information. When we can relate new information to existing understanding or make meaning out of our learning, we have a much better chance of retaining the information and using it later. The final guideline in this principle serves to help learners make meaning, tie the new information to existing understanding, and demonstrate how the information can be used to solve problems. The third principle demonstrates how to best facilitate options. First, you have to make the options available to all students for how they interact with the information, beginning with the physical interface. Next, you're giving students options for how they can express what they know. How do they want to solve the problem or communicate the idea? How do they want to demonstrate their level of mastery of a skill? Support for those options should be included because an option that isn't accessible really isn't an option. Finally, in the third guideline, you're helping students decide which option is best for them in each situation and to reflect on their performance. Well, that's an overview of the guidelines. Keep in mind that implementing UDL is a marathon, not a sprint, so don't feel pressured to take on every checkpoint at once. You'll dive deeper into each one in future modules, but we hope this video helps take some of the mystery out of what could be, at first glance, a rather daunting document.
And I think James makes a great point. Start small, choose a particular checkpoint or guideline or principle, and start from there. Improve your knowledge and your expertise in that one area, and then grow across other guidelines, principles, and checkpoints.
All right, so since you guys saw that video and we let it run the full just about 6 minutes or so to do a deeper dive for you there. So we're just gonna gloss over a few of these points again. We'll dive deeper, or you'll have the opportunity to dive deeper as you work on your own. So just to review quickly that the principles are at the top, the 3 principles: engagement, representation, action, expression. The guidelines are these 9 guidelines that you see in the yellow boxes. And then the checkpoints are those bullet points below. There are several versions of the UDL guidelines that you may see on the internet. Previous versions had representation before engagement, and the checkpoints were actually numbered. So you may see a couple of different variations of this, but this is the latest and greatest that CAST has put out. So pay special attention to these tabs on the left because they are there for good reason. At the top level, we have access. So if you're looking to work with students and just providing access, the very basic level, you're gonna look at this band that goes across the top here. So if you're talking about recruiting interest, options for perception and physical action, look at these individual checkpoints and think about how you may be able to, again, this is interactive, so you can click on these, get some ideas about minimizing threats and distractions. Okay, so if you're thinking of, let's say, a kindergarten classroom and one particular student never wants to go to carpet time, he doesn't want to sit down, he avoids it, behaviors are left and right. Think about what might be threatening or distracting for him at carpet time. Is it potentially he always has to sit next to a particular peer that he doesn't get along with? Our space is not well defined on the carpet area, and he knows that kids are going to be rolling around on top of him. Is it that he knows that dancing and singing is coming and that's not one of his preferred interests? So how do we reduce some of those threats or distractions in the environment to help the student? Similarly, in high school, is it threatening that the student has to transition from a general education classroom, walk across the lunch area in front of his peers, and potentially go into a self-contained class? And there's that threat of how are my peers gonna view me? So how might we mitigate some of those barriers? So again, that's just the access band at the top, and it goes across the kind of very basics. Then we work on building these skills, because what we're working to do is gradual release of responsibility from the top to the bottom to create expert learners. So building on our skills, sustaining effort and persistence. So once we have students who we've recruited their interest and they're engaged, now how are we going to keep them continuing through the task? How are we going to keep Kevin pursuing or persevering through that romance novel, right? How do we sustain his effort and persistence? And so those skills are building on the access level and go across the band, across the guidelines. And then finally, we have internalizing. So how are we going to get kids to be independent on their own, motivated? And how are they going to sustain their regulation? How are they going to develop their self-assessment and reflection? And similarly, all the way across the guidelines, increasing their executive functions. And kids are starting to set goals for themselves. We're not just setting them for them. And support their planning and strategy development. So this is, again, release of responsibility from it's really teacher-focused at the beginning at that access level. What's the teacher going to do? And then as we build and internalize, it's what's the student going to do to take over their own learning? And so that goes across the guidelines. And ultimately, again, all the way through the system and through the guidelines, leading to expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-directed. So next, we're just going to briefly get into engagement, because I think we've covered quite a bit of this, but it is the first principle. And again, the main guidelines are recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. So you'll see on this set of guidelines that they're numbered. And when you go into the interactive section, some of the checkpoints may be 7.1, 7.2. Again, that's how it was referenced in one of the previous versions. But engagement is really coming out of the why of learning, so the affective network. And you'll hear your students often say, well, why do I need to know this? When am I ever going to use this? But they really need to know because they need to make meaning of it. They need to connect to it so that they can sustain their interest and they can persevere through the task. And this is the fight or flight. So kids either perceive this as beneficial or threatening in their environment and in their instruction. So we really need to get to the hook to engage them and continue their learning so that they can start to self-monitor and persevere through the task. Because kids know that the environment and the instruction is either good for them or bad for them, right? They know that right when they walk in the door. So what's on the Padlet, and you see her on your screen, is called the Translation Guide. And you can use this document as you're expanding on your learning to look at what does this look like in the classroom. So when we're talking about on the left, the guidelines and checkpoints, optimizing and recruiting interest and effort, what does that translate to? And then what does that look like in my own classroom? So feel free to use these guides as you're working on your own. There's one for each of the principles for you posted on the Padlet. So I don't think we're gonna have time for this, Kevin, am I right?
Yes, correct. But this is a high school video that focuses on the principle of engagement and how the teacher allows students to engage in their work by choosing areas or points of interest around social justice. And then giving them multiple opportunities to decide how they would like to learn about the information that they've decided upon and how they would like to demonstrate their knowledge and their learning. But this is also on your Padlet. We just wanted to make sure that we called it out in the section that it was related to in the presentation.
And don't skip over the very beginning of the video because the teacher talks about how he was reflecting on his own learning to be the best educator for his kids he could be during a year of time off. So getting into representation, again, very quickly, we've seen the guidelines here, but the principle of representation, the 3 guidelines are perception, language and symbols, and comprehension. And this is a little funny. That was an awesome worksheet. It said, no student ever, because how are we presenting information to kids? Are we just sort of moving them through the system and providing whatever the curriculum kit came with, or are we really providing multiple ways for kids to access and make meaning? So this comes out of the temporal lobe, and it's about how we gather facts and categorize what we're seeing, hearing, and reading through various modalities. And again, translation guide for you here. So what does it look like in the guidelines and checkpoints? How does that translate? And then how does that generalize to my classroom? And then lastly, action and expression, again, 3rd principle with physical action, expression, and communication, and executive functions to create expert learners. So keep calm and express yourself. And this is the how of the learning. How we organize and express our ideas. Are we writing an essay? Are we solving a math problem? And is there only one way for kids to show what they learn, know, and can do? Are they only doing multiplication tests? Are they only doing an essay after they've read a novel? How are they showing us everything that they've absorbed and everything that they're going to apply? And so having multiple ways to do that. So they've read a novel and maybe they can do a collage, or they can do a skit, or they can do a flip grid, or they can write an essay if they want, or they can answer multiple choice questions. So it's based on a rubric that the teacher has created so that the students know how to demonstrate mastery of a skill, right? And that rubric is shared with the kids. It's no secret. It's like when teachers say, well, we're gonna have a test on Friday. Well, what's gonna be on it? I don't know, you'll find out. It's like, we don't wanna, just surprise our students. We wanna be engaged in their learning. Hey, these are the concepts, these are the goals all week. So your tests are gonna look like this. In the assessment, you'll have some options and choice. So just to do things differently than we've always done before. And again, translation guide here, same manner to use on your own.
So we're going to take what we've learned about the UDL framework, the principles, the guidelines, and the checkpoints, and we're going to move that into lesson design. So we're staying with universal design for learning. We're just going to take what we've learned, and then we're going to review the process for thinking about lesson designing in a very specific order. And they compare it to Copernicus, an astrologer who really made the discovery that the planets don't revolve around Earth, but the planets all revolve around the sun. So that change in focus is similar to not having a focus on the curriculum, but having a focus on the students and the students' need, and then applying the curriculum, the materials, and the methods to what students need in order to further their learning. So we're going to talk about those 4 components of lesson design: goals, assessments, methods, and materials, specifically in that order in the development of lesson planning. So to start with, just a quick overview of UDL lesson designing. UDL provides a blueprint for creating instructional goals, assessments, methods, and materials. And we're going to keep coming back to those 4 areas in that order that work for everyone, not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but a flexible approach that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. So moving on to the next slide, I think we're going to have some boxes come in. We're going to focus on those goals, how to develop goals, specifically looking at the verbs, related assessments and how the assessments are analyzed for potential barriers, and then the related methods and the related materials, all referring back to the development of that goal. What are we teaching? What are we assessing? How are we teaching it? And what do the students have in front of them to increase their learning? So identifying potential barriers. We have identifying learner variability. So we're going to kind of take this back to the order of the presentation. We talked about learner variability through the lens of identity. We're going to develop the goal of the lesson. We're going to identify potential barriers. Then we're going to assign assessments that are related to what we are teaching the students based on the goal, and also looking at those potential barriers. And then we're going to determine what methods, what teaching, instructional methods will we employ, but also keeping the idea of potential barriers in the back of our mind in order to mitigate them before any instruction has been delivered. And finally, we're going to look at materials. What materials do we have available to us so that students can increase their learning through manipulatives, through videos, any type of technology specifically related to that learning goal. And we're going to keep going back. So we're going to look at each one of these areas through the lens of potential barriers, mitigating the barriers by understanding the learner variability to develop, at the very bottom, expert learners. There we go. So that's the UDL process for lesson design. So we're going to go through this section a little bit quickly, and we've included the lesson plan template that we've referred to on the Padlet, just so you can make the connection to what we're talking about to how the template is designed. So when we look at our goal development, UDL lessons are going to start with that clear learning goal. Do the students know what they're working toward? Does the teacher have the clear methods and materials to get the students there and to determine their progress through their assessments? They have to be standards based and include a verb that fosters multiple means of action and expression. So when we design our lesson goal, then we have to look at that verb, because that verb dictates how students will express their knowledge and understanding. But we're also going to look at 2 different sets of standards. And then we have to separate the goal from the means of achieving them. So the goal is for every student. The way that students reach that goal and demonstrate their knowledge and understanding can vary. So let's look at this a little bit closer. So when we're looking at our standards-based lesson goal, we can divide the standards into 2 areas. One is a content standard and the other is a method standard. And the way we progress students toward reaching those goals can be different. And we can look at the verb to understand which is which. So the example of a content standard, it means explain the function of phrases and clauses in general and their function in specific sentence. Because that verb is explain, students can demonstrate their knowledge and mastery of that standard through an explanation in many different ways. Conversely, the method standard example, write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or texts using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. That verb is specific to writing. Students have to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of that goal or standard through written language. So the difference between those 2 standards need to be very, very clear in the development of that lesson plan. So the content standard, it requires students to know something, their knowledge base, at the end of that lesson, as opposed to a method standard where students have to do something or show their ability within that specific expectation around the verb. You can differentiate your lesson Oh, we went one slide. You can differentiate your lesson by providing choices in the content standard as well as the method standard. And we've given you a couple examples of how you can teach through a content standard or a method standard and how you can allow students to demonstrate their ability. So what we're actually talking about in Universal Design for Learning, when we're teaching the students, that's representing the information. When students are expressing themselves, that's the action expression principle. And in order to get there, students need to be engaged. And there's your 3 principles. And then just an example of what those various standards might look like. So students can explain the function of the phrases and clauses using multiple ways, whereas with that method standard of writing, the educators can represent the information in multiple ways, and then students can also be provided materials that will still be assessing the same standard, but allow for a bit of variability in the way that they express themselves. So the question that we want to ask is, what potential barriers might this pose based on your variability of learners, and how will you mitigate them? So the method standards are very specific and very narrow, whereas the content standards are very broad, and that's where we can be really creative. So these are just some content standard verbs that you might use in your lesson goal design for those content standards, okay? So an example of that, if you click one more time, if we're trying to teach the skill of understanding the concept of time, and the standard that just is at the top of your screen here, students will tell and write time in hours. That's the skill, and half hours, using analog and digital clocks. Now, if we define tell as oral language or oral output and writing as written expression, then are we really getting to the skill that we're trying to teach, which is time? So if the skill is time, but our assessment is that students are going to tell and write, think of a student who is unable to speak, or a student that doesn't have the written ability to describe their knowledge level. What are other ways that they can demonstrate their knowledge of telling time? They can point, we can model, they can manipulate a model. So this would be a content standard that if we define the verb more broadly, we will get a clearer understanding of a true student's ability. And then we also provided you some examples of potential barriers. So this is just for your use within the categories of academics, physical and sensory, and social emotional. So we can click through these. So academic considerations, what are potential barriers? And then what are possible solutions? Same thing with the next area. Physical considerations, what are some physical barriers to the learning environment? And then what are some possible solutions? And then social emotional considerations. What are some potential barriers and what are some possible solutions? And this is the mindset when we're lesson planning, is to identify those potential barriers and then to mitigate those potential barriers. So our lesson planning template, this is what it looks like. You wouldn't do this for every lesson, of course, but just to kind of get your thinking on how the process works. Next slide. So step 1, let's develop that lesson objective. Make sure that we've identified any potential barriers within that lesson objective. And for an activity, you can go to your lesson planning template, download it from the Padlet, and begin filling out the lesson objectives by choosing your content standard on which it's based. So the area at the top of the template, you'll see what's the grade level, the Common Core standard, the grade time, the estimated time, and then the lesson objective. And this is where you're going to really analyze that lesson objective, okay? So step 2, here's where we consider our learner variability. Who has access, who doesn't have access? So based on that variability, what barriers and solutions should be addressed? And in your lesson planning template, you will find those sections, that section just above the principles. So your considerations for learner variability, and then we're going to move into all the components, the guidelines and the checkpoints within each principle to make those considerations to mitigate barriers. And then the assessment piece, making sure that our formative and our summative assessments are completely barrier-free to get at valid and reliable assessment of all of our students' knowledge and mastery of that goal that we've developed. Just a couple points about assessment. The one that I really want to call out, that your assessments have to measure both product and product, but they have to be construct relevant. So going back to the instruction around time, if we're trying to teach the skill of time, but we're assessing the ability of a student to speak and write, then we are not developing a lesson that is construct relevant. So keep that in mind. Are we teaching what we're assessing? That's your connection. So back to your lesson planning template, at the very bottom of page 1, you will see an opportunity to design your formative and your summative assessments. And again, you have to go back up to the goal in order to assess whether or not you're assessing what you're teaching. Next is methods. What methods will we use to ensure that we're including the decisions, the approaches, the procedures and routines that teachers use to accelerate or enhance learning, not to create a ceiling or a barrier for students? We have to make sure that the students stay motivated to learn, comprehend the information, and strategically approach tasks. And those are your 3 principles. Staying motivated is the engagement principle, comprehend the information is the representation principle, and strategically approach, or that executive functioning, how am I going to best meet that goal and design my path? That's your executive functioning in the action and expression principle. And here's some examples of often used methods. And in many of the methods that we use, there are inherent barriers for certain student populations. That's where we go back to the variability of learners. So having think, pair, share, that may not work for some students. Think of students with ADHD or students who don't have the social skills in order to interact with a peer. Have we set down the routines in our class, or are the lack of routines actually a barrier for students to be successful? Step 4, in your lesson planning template, you can enter the methods. And this is really the area where we get to the core of lesson planning. So what methods are we employing in our anticipatory set? What methods are we utilizing when we're modeling that new skill and knowledge? What's the guided practice and independent practice methods that we'll employ? And finally, what's our closing? Within each of those areas, we look at the methods. What are the potential barriers based on our learner variability to develop expert learners? Which brings us to the last area in the lesson design is materials. What materials do we have access to, and what are those potential barriers that materials may present for certain students? I love the line in the bigger paragraph that says, essentially those people who could function well in a print-based environment were favored. We even called them book smart. We're not in a situation anymore where books are our only way to obtain information. There's so many more opportunities, and that's where our flexible means are multiple options for students to access and demonstrate what they know and what they've learned. So in the materials, just a couple points. Engaging learners, they have to have many options, and knowledge being dispensed through one of 2 gatekeepers, the teacher or the textbook, long gone. And just gave you a couple examples of what are some high-tech materials and what are some low-tech materials. It doesn't mean we have to go to technology every time, but many of the low-tech activities and materials that teacher employ are equally as effective, if not even more. And in your lesson plan, you can go to the very bottom of the 2nd page. What materials and supplies do you have access to that would directly relate back to the goal that we've set? And then finally, it's not part of the process, but we also have to consider what prerequisites what prerequisite skills will students need to have in order to be successful? What do we need to front load with? And that might be executive functioning skills, giving them organization sheets, giving them timelines. How are we helping them to plan, to organize, prioritize, to set their goals? What are the behavior expectations? What are the rules for getting into the routines that we create? And have students mastered those routines, which could be a barrier for students to be successful in the reaching of their lesson objective. And you can find that right at the top. That's kind of your last step. Once you've designed your lesson, go back and look at the skills necessary that will enhance the student learning and deepening their level of knowledge within that lesson. And then you can go back and complete the prerequisite section. So that's your lesson planning piece. And as I said, your lesson plan templates and examples are on your Padlet. One of the other resources that's on the Padlet, I think it's in the second column, is your essential elements. And you can access all of the essential elements from kindergarten through 12th grade, and it's every Common Core standard in English language, arts, and math available. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what each one looks like. Each essential element looks exactly like the one on the screen. There's 3 columns. The first column is the Common Core standard as written. The second column is the essential element, or what do we want students with significant cognitive disabilities to know and learn. So that relates directly back to that Common Core standard. And we're talking about a 4th grade standard. It's a 4th grade writing standard here. So in that essential element that was pulled out of that Common Core standard is then broken into 4 levels. The first level is actually level 4. That's students with mild significant cognitive disabilities. Level 3, or the second level down, is students with moderate significant disabilities. Level 2 is severe, students with more severe cognitive disabilities. And then the final essential element rewritten for students with more profound disabilities. And we get the question all the time, with students that are functioning far below grade level, how do we design grade level aligned lessons? This is one way to do it. So looking at the Common Core standard, pulling out the essential element, and then realigning that essential element based on student knowledge and ability connects us back to that Common Core standard at grade level. You're also provided in that far right column instructional examples of what that essential element looks like. So it'll give you ideas when you're developing your lessons. This is an instructional example based on the level of my student once we've determined where the student is currently functioning. So this is one of those resources that teachers and administrators kind of flip out on because they're like, where's this been all my life? We've highlighted some of the standards in yellow, like it is on the screen. Since this is a federal document, we wanted to make it specific to California. So these are the standards that are highlighted in yellow that are tested on the California alternate assessment. So it just calls out very, very brightly that this is a standard to really focus on when we're addressing this through our lesson goal. Okay, if you have any questions, please email Kristen or I, and we can talk you through that resource. The other resource that's on your Padlet, this is in the first column, we've taken the preschool learning foundations and we've color-coded each one. So you can see in the front matter that's on the far right, they mention universal design for learning, and then we color-coded each of the references based on the principles. And then let's look at a specific foundation. So we've taken each of those foundation and task analyzed them so that in red, you'll see read the familiar book written in the home language or in English is your representation. They're going to read. When encouraged by others, which is your engagement, we're encouraging them by engaging them in the book. And then how do they express themselves? They will, in the home language, they will talk about the books. So you can see it's the instructional cycle. Information in, engagement happens, and then information out. And that's how the lesson design is related back to that UDL guidelines. Just another way to look at those. And then one other video that we wanted to call out is the preschool video where Mrs. Kungu teaches her students multiple ways to understand the same math concept related to preschool, of course. So we put it in the preschool section and put it on your Padlet for you to view and answer the questions as part of your activities. And then lastly, coming to the close, we've also provided you the California teaching performance expectations. So Kristen, you can just pull up all the bullets. We gave you an overview of the various teaching performance expectations for the universal, the mild moderate, and the extensive support teaching performance expectations. But we did something a little bit different. So on our next, we also gave you access to this document, and then the next document on the next slide starts the connection of resources to each of the TPE elements. So we went through each of the elements. You can see universal designing is called out in TPE 1. On the right side of the document, we've connected various resources and explanations of how that TPE might present itself in class as we're monitoring our student teacher candidates and allowing our student teacher candidates that if there's an area that you want to become more proficient in, these are some resources or contexts that will help you improve in those areas. And we've done this for 5 of the 6 TPEs. So Kristen, if you just kind of page through, there's TPE number 2, TPE number 3. You can see all of the activities and resources. And then TPE 5, assessing student learning. You can see that the assessment piece comes into our lesson planning process in that step number 2. We didn't do the same thing for TPE number 6, but developing as a professional educator is going to be your own process, your own areas of interest. But we did want to call out element number 2 that's specifically focused on implicit bias and explicit biases in the way that we approach our students and design our lessons and continue to keep our expectations high. So that is all on your Padlet for you to access. And one of our favorite quotes by Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So we also wanted to close out with a reminder to take the survey, which is also on the Padlet in the far right-hand side. And speaking for Kristen and myself, just thank you so much to Don Cardinal and Audrey and Jill for asking us to be a part of this amazing webinar series. So good luck to everyone, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, Kevin and Kristen. What a great webinar with lots of great resources. We appreciate your expertise in this area and a lot to unpack. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share with us your expertise. And we'd appreciate if you could provide us your feedback with the survey. It's in the chat as well as on the Padlet. Thank you for all your time and have a great afternoon.